Chapter 25. Scott and Tom followed the Noguchi woman through a deserted alley in the dark town. Scott wasn't sure where they were headed, but Noguchi moved with certainty. He glanced over his shoulder from time to time, wary of the huge alien that brought up the rear. They had left the dead woman behind, soaked her corpse with fuel, and set it ablaze. After listening to Noguchi's summary of what had happened in the last 28 hours, Scott hurried to talk to her. "Are you saying that they," he tilted his head back towards the giant, "let those bugs loose on a populated planet so they could hunt them?" He kept his voice low. Noguchi nodded. "Just a theory, but it fits. Except I don't think his kind knew there were humans on Ryushi, and from his actions they weren't supposed to be shooting at us. We haven't been here that long, and it looks pretty certain that they were here before." Her voice was edged with dry sarcasm when next she spoke. "I imagine we would have remembered if they'd visited recently." Tom stumbled behind them. Scott stopped and turned to his back, but the giant stepped forward and set the pilot on his feet as if he weighed nothing. Tom nodded at the creature, waved a hand, and moved to join Scott and Noguchi. She continued talking. "And I imagine our presence probably screwed up their plans." Scott raised his eyebrows. "Screwed up their plans? Oh, that's great. I feel so much better knowing that this whole fucking mess was an accident." Noguchi shrugged. "Hey, at least he's on our side." "Until he gets hungry," Scott mumbled under his breath. Noguchi stopped at the end of the alley and waited for the giant to catch up to them. She kept her revolver barrel pointed up. "Okay, the stampede started just around the corner here. We're going to walk through its path and see if there's anything left alive that shouldn't be." "Swell." Scott looked around for some kind of weapon. Besides a few small rocks, they were out of luck. They'd have to stick close to the woman. The giant hefted a large spear and seemed to wait for Noguchi's signal. "Go." The alien and Noguchi crouched out into the open compound, weapons ready. Scott's heart raced. He looked over at Tom, who shrugged. They stepped out together to join the other two. It wasn't as if they had a whole lot of choice here now, was it? "Holy shit," Tom said. Scott forgot his fear for a second or two. The stretch of open ground was littered with dozens of bodies, Rinth, bug, and giant alien. Large patches of soil were eaten away to reveal charred black, splatter-like stains, as if the blood from the corpses was toxic. The Rinth were cut or blown open, chests shattered, throats slit. The black bugs were mostly crushed, so also the giants. The only light was from a sole street lamp that hadn't been broken or shot out. The resulting mix of dark and death and shadows was forbidding, ominous, ugly. "When you kill something, you don't fool around," said Scott. Noguchi wasn't listening. Her gaze darted from side to side, her revolver still up. The giant's head was cocked to one side, his stance ready. The two of them moved forward slowly. The pilots stayed close. The four of them made their way cautiously down the ravaged street, stepped over torn bodies and corpses smashed down deep into the cracked earth. Apparently, this was where the fight had ended. After a moment of tense silence, Tom whispered loudly to Scott as they followed their armed escorts. "Do you think the stampede got all of them?" Scott started to reply, but stopped short. He had heard something behind them, the cry of a bird perhaps, a chittering sound. Behind one of the storage buildings, sudden movement. Scott felt his mouth go dry. He had heard it before. "Run," he said, hardly able to get the word out. "Run!" The Shunde heard the hard meat and spun around. He sprinted past the two Ooman strangers towards the threat, staff forward. He was dimly aware that the small warrior was right behind. It shouted something at the other two. They came in a single file stream, flowed from around a structure. 10, maybe 12. The Shunde leapt to greet them. Two arrived first, angled in from the sides. The Shunde spun, swung completely around, cut them both through their midsections in one strike. He didn't watch them hit the ground. There was no need. They were dead, and all he needed to do was avoid the throws. He extended his kasitipa and slashed through the throat of the next drone nearest, to his right. The drone's death cry was garbled through its own thwei. A split second later, he jabbed the staff point through the jaws of another, twisted the sharp blade and dug a hole through the top of its skull. The weapon's metal was proof against the hard meat's thwei, but there was no time to hesitate and enjoy the kill. When you fought 10,000, you did so one at a time, but you also had to do so quickly. He thrust the spear's butt back, hard, and knocked one behind him down, then turned and slashed its gut. Digest this, foolish creature. The kasitipa blurred again, jammed backhand into yet another hard meat chest. The drone howled, fell, did not die but did not rise again. Acid pumped into the dark air, pooled, smoking. The Shunde jumped forward, stabbed the throat of yet another, and then spun to meet the next. Death fell all around his feet as he and the hard meat danced. Noguchi heard what sounded like a bird and turned. Broken Tusk was faster. He ran past the two pilots towards the main storage shed. He was eager, and if he had any fear of the dark monsters, it was not apparent. Follow the tower around to the east lock. She would just have to hope that the pilots listened. She hurled herself after the warrior. Several of the bugs streamed from behind the shed and towards Broken Tusk. He stepped into battle without hesitation. Too many of them, 10, 12. She aimed at one of the bugs, and it was dead before she fired. She took aim again, and again her target had already fallen. She took a step back, transfixed by the swift movements of the giant warrior. Here was no inexperienced novice. Every step was measured, every strike timed and sure. Within the space of a few seconds, most of the bugs were down, dead, or dying. She had enough training to recognize a master when she saw one. This one's skill had been gained in battle against deadly enemies. Broken Tusk whirled and jabbed, crouched and slashed with precision and confidence. Never a misstep, never a hesitation. He was no dojo tiger covered in padding and fighting for points. Wherever he had come from, they had a martial arts more complex and dangerous than any she'd ever seen. It was like a choreographed dance. Except we don't have all day. She aimed and fired several shots, then aimed and fired again. The last two shrieked and stumbled. Broken Tusk hesitated, confused perhaps, then finished them both off with slashes to the gut. Sorry. Noguchi ejected the spent rounds and slapped in a loader. But we've got to go. Broken Tusk stared at her for a second, then raised one claw. In understanding or camaraderie she couldn't know. She returned the move, then started towards the east lock. The warrior caught up to her easily, then slowed and strode at her side as they rounded the front of the ops building towards the lock. He made thick, growling noises, strange, but somehow not threatening. Ahead, the lock was open. Conover stood by the control panel inside, face pale. Noguchi heard now familiar chirping noises behind them, not far. Hurry! Conover shouted. Noguchi and Broken Tusk ran through the entry together. The door slammed down. A second later, there were several thundering crashes. The metal door shook as the nightmare creatures threw themselves at it, but it wouldn't give. Noguchi collapsed against the frame and closed her eyes. They were safe, at least for the moment. Safe and fucked. They hadn't gotten them all. The plan hadn't worked.